here today. I heard her give a talk a couple of years ago, and I said we must have her visit with us here at Teachers College, so I'm glad she's here. I'm not going to say much more about her because I'm going to ask our provost, Thomas James, who's been provost and dean of the college and vice president for academic affairs here at Teachers College since 2007. Prior to that, Tom had been dean of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Graduate School of Education, and prior to that was at NYU as a vice dean. But he's a member of our faculty here. This is our 125th anniversary of Teachers College. So I should start by saying happy birthday to everyone here today. And I note that because the other thing I wanted to say about Provost James, in addition to his vision and his critical understanding of how faculty do their work, which I so appreciate, he was quite enthusiastic when I said that I wanted to launch a special series at Teachers College that would look at the connections between biology, behavior, and environment. And I really deeply appreciate the fact that he has supported that over the last couple of years. But perhaps most importantly, and many people don't know this, but as a child, Provost James was at the John Dewey School at the University of Chicago. So there's a deep connection between Provost James, John Dewey, and through that connection to Teachers College that continues to this day with his leadership. So Tom, I'm glad that you could come by today to welcome and introduce Linda Freed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, John, and welcome everyone to this colloquium. I'm really delighted to see that there's a mix of faculty and students and people from the larger community. We're very, very excited to have Linda Freed with us here today. She's been at Columbia for 5 years, I believe, and it's really been just a wonderful force of change and constructive development, not only within the Mailman School of Public Health, but as an exemplar of leadership. And I've watched their curricular review. I've watched a number of just amazing initiatives there. And it's really heartening, in this complex world that we're in, to see that leadership can really make a difference. She is the dean of the Mailman School of Public Health. She is the DeLamar professor, which is an endowed chair. She's also vice president for the larger medical school complex that is there, so that we're part of a very significant part of the healthcare research and leadership component in the United States, and she's really playing a key role there. I was drawn to her work when we first met. In fact, when I read the first, I think, press release when she came, because of one of her activities, which is the ExperienceCore. And you've heard of the Peace Corps, you've heard of City Corps, you've heard of these going back to the 1930s. There was a corps created in the Great Depression as well, and this visionary idea of combining health promotion for the elderly who need active lives and need engagement, and directing that attention toward the very great needs we have for development in young people, for academic development, for tutoring, for mentoring. And this visionary effort has brought those together, and I think is really a sign of the kind of constructive social ideas we really need in this country. I know, though I'm not an expert in her field, that she has a significant base of scientific research. Is really widely respected for her work on frailty, and also path-breaking and important work on cardiovascular disease and how we can age in healthy ways and be strong as our population ages. I know much less about this than John does and that many people do here, but I'm impressed because that really relates to something that's fundamental to us at Teachers College, which is leading healthy lives, being healthy learners, and doing that in a lifelong way. So with that, I'd like to present Dean Linda Freed.
Tom, John, thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be here. Is the mic on, and can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. So I'm going to get myself rigged up here and see where we can go. So I tried to come up with with what some people think is a provocative title, but I think it's the kind of question that we need to be asking. Where are our children in an aging society that's a successful one? Because there are some givens. We are an aging society, and we do have children, and we need to create a society that's good for everybody, and there are a lot of fears about that. As we're living longer lives, that somehow having more older people in the population is going to kill the future for our kids. So I'd like to think about that for a few minutes with you. And I'll start by what I think of as the history of life history. This issue of longer lives is very recent. In fact, it takes every time, I've been looking at this data for 25 years, and it takes my breath away every single time, because from the dawn of humanity up until almost 1900, so the late 19th century, life expectancy globally at birth was 24 years. So a child could expect to live 24 years on average starting at birth. That's an astounding piece of data, particularly if you look at what happens starting shortly before 1900, which is life expectancy started to rise globally, and it is continuing to do so. In fact, the US has experienced that. In 1900, life expectancy in the US at birth was under 50 years, and for African Americans it was well under 50 years. Fast forward a century, and we have succeeded, actually, through human endeavor, in adding well over 30 years to human life expectancy. An extraordinary feat that has never been accomplished before in human history. Never. It's an amazing success, and it's a success of education, public health, medical care, and poverty alleviation. We've done this. It's what we wanted. So now the question is, how do we think about it, and what do we do with it? And for our kids, this is a big deal, and for public health, it's a big deal, because in fact, we need to think, we have not thought very much, if at all, about how we prepare to have longer lives. I have two kids in their 20s, and when I look at their cohort, they are making, it would seem to me, I don't have a lot of data on this except anecdotes, but it would seem to me that they are making a lot of assumptions in their life decisions that they have a really long time to live and there's no rush. And I would bet that that is them making a lot of assumptions about life expectancy and rolling that into a lot of things they're deciding up front here without much preparation. And the question is, should we be teaching our young people differently? Should we be giving them different skills? Should we be preparing them not just how they're going to live a life of 3 to 5 careers, and a third of their lives after retirement, but also how we invest all the way along in health and the ability to be productive and have a meaningful life. Now, this is a worldwide phenomenon. The world's population is aging. These are population pyramids. Globally, you can see in 1950, we were a very nice triangle. Most people were young globally, and that's been shifting. People are living longer and longer. This is 2000. These are the projections to 2050 for the world. If you look on every continent, you see similar patterns. That there's this shift from a triangle of most people being young. This is birth, death, and the older state, living to the older stages. Same rightward shift from a triangle towards a rectangle of more and more people living longer lives. It's true in the most developed countries, absolutely, and it's true in the least developed countries. And in fact, in the least developed countries, globally, right now, young people are growing up in young societies, in youth bulge societies, and because life expectancy is increasing so quickly, those same young people are going to grow old in an old society. They're growing up as children in a young society, and they're going to grow old in an old society in their lifetime. Because of increased life expectancy, of course, and the proportion of people in the population who are living to longer ages is increasing dramatically. And the U.S. is actually at the back of the pack among the developed nations. We will only reach 20% of our population being 65 and older by about 2030. Many other countries like Japan and Chile and India and Italy are well ahead of us. And globally, you can see here in the shaded areas, the lighter shades, the proportion 60 and over, and you can see that that proportion is going to steadily increase worldwide to 2050 and beyond. So globally, almost all countries are experiencing greater life expectancy. You may not see the proportion yet increasing. But what does that mean? Well, it means that we are going very quickly toward a world in which there are more older adults than children. And the question for us is how to prepare for that, I think, in a way that meets the needs of an aging population in a compassionate and just society. Certainly there are people who are vulnerable at any age, but particularly at the very end of life, we need to ensure that. But we need to figure out how to do it in a way that is good for all age groups. And so I'd like to throw out some thoughts, because actually, if we are becoming an aging society, it is not only not too soon to figure this one out, but if we don't figure it out, I think the consequences are bad for everyone without preparation. Because I deeply believe that transitioning to an aging society and living longer lives is an issue for young people even more than it is an issue for older people right now. Now, there are some paradoxes. We're stuck with a bunch of myths and perceptions that are getting in the way of thinking about this clearly. It's been my observation that as individuals, we all want that longer life. So when I teach undergraduates at Columbia College, I always ask them, how many of you want that extra 30 years? And in any 100 students, 98 say yes and 2 say no. And the 2 who say no, pretty predictably, when I asked them, they said, well, it was actually conditional. Smart, Barnard Columbia students, they say, depends on whether I'm healthy or not. But in general, we all want these years. We're not ready to give them back individually. We want them for our family, for people we love, for our friends. But we are perceiving that as a society, this is actually a disaster for society. So there's really a conflict here. We need to come to grips with that. In fact, for 25 years, if you look at the headlines in the paper, they look like this all the time. Right? Panel seeks cuts in Social Security. The high cost of health care, too many older people to take care of, can't afford Medicare, entitled to what? There's a retirement crisis coming. That's the headlines we see about transforming to an aging society, the thing we worked so hard to get. So, and if you aggregate those, what you experience when you look at the paper in conversation is that our perception of the implications of being an aging society, i.e. having more older people around, is that it's a net negative. It's, in fact, a deficit situation. That's the language we use. We have this looming population of old people with high needs and low contributions, and it's just a negative. I see lots of heads going up and down, so you understand what I'm saying. That's what we say to each other, that's what we think, that's what our anxiety is, And all of that drives what our policies are. In fact, we have a policy metric for how we think and feel, which is called the Oldage Dependency ratio. And it drives our policies in this country as well as globally. What is that? Well, the Oldage Dependency ratio is the number of people who are 65 and older, and sometimes we lump together all the dependent people and say 65 and older and 18 and younger, relative to the number of working age, 20 to 64. Now, that makes a lot of assumptions, that the people above the line contribute nothing to society and they're entirely dependent, and the people below the line are entirely contributing and able to work, and that it's only this that determines our success as a society. Now, if we're limited to this, the policies that get driven are the headlines that I just showed you. Oh my God, we can't afford this, more older people, less working age people putting money into the equation, we better defund Social Security, we can't afford Medicare. In fact, the answers on Social Security are pretty easy, but we're so wrapped up in the mythology that we haven't actually changed the narrative. The problem in this, I think, is who we're talking about. Because who's an aging population? It's all of us. It's the people we love. We're talking about our parents, our grandparents, our kids' future, because they're going to be older too. And so when I think about that, I think not so fast. Maybe we should just step back a little bit and double check that defunding all these social protections, saying we don't have the room for all these old people, maybe we need to just do a double check as to whether that's the right policy direction. Because if we don't want it for the people we love, maybe it's not so good for us as a society. And so across my career, I've been spending a lot of time trying to say, well, is there a different way? Is there a different way to think about this? Can we create a positive reality that gets past the myths and actually appreciates the degree to which there is not an imbalance or figures out how to create a balance so everybody wins? So let me suggest perhaps a few thoughts about this. First, let's think about the Social Security and Medicare thing. All that money going to old people. Well, first of all, of course, Social Security and Medicare, for Social Security in particular, you've paid for your whole life, right? I'm being a little simplistic on the policy side, but there's another dimension to this, unrecognized, unremembered by most of us, which is that both Social Security in the 1930s and Medicare in 1964 were enacted as family policies. They were not enacted just for the needs of older people. They were enacted to protect working age people who, if they went to do the right things by their parents, would be at risk of losing their entire standard of living. And so Social Security and Medicare were enacted to preserve families. We've lost that narrative. Now let's think about the old age dependency ratio. Is it right? Do older people contribute nothing to society? Is this the metric that should drive our understanding of where the potential is for benefiting from having more older people around? Is there potential? So I tend to think about this ratio in, I've come to think actually that this ratio actually not only drives policies but is paranoid. That there's a ratio paranoia that underlies a lot of our policies, and that we better do a double check about whether there are benefits or just costs of an aging society. So let's think about a few of the myths and implications for that ratio. First of all, is it true that all old people are dependent? Since that's what the title says. In fact, the numbers would say in this country, in this society, with older people living healthier and better educated than ever before, absolutely not. Among community-dwelling older adults in the U.S., you can see the dependency rates just in terms of difficulty walking a half mile here. They're very low. Even in the oldest age group, it's less than a third of people having difficulty walking. So, and likely if you're not having difficulty walking in the main, you're not having difficulty with other things. So, those data not so convincing. How about what having older adults does for society itself? Well, in fact, we know that older adults in communities play very important roles in our country and throughout societies in terms of cohesion, in terms of the communication of core values, in terms of caregiving and raising of grandchildren, role models. Certainly in the U.S., Community Glue and Community Watch are very important roles for older adults. And interestingly, they're an important political force that, contrary to mythology, doesn't vote their interests, their parochial interests, as an age group. They do not vote in a block by age. In addition, older adults contribute a lot of resources. Certainly, increasingly, older people want to work, and there's a mythology that jobs for old people take jobs away from children. It is a mythology, and the data do not bear that out. In fact, they're the contrary, that the more older people who are working in a society, the wealthier a society seems to be, and the more jobs get created for young people. Interesting. And beyond that, it seems that there's very interesting data showing that intergenerational work teams are actually more productive than single-generation work teams. But in addition, older adults in communities in this country, do a huge amount of volunteering. In fact, if you added up the in-kind value, it's at least $162 billion a year of in-kind volunteering, which happens to actually exceed the amount of money we need for long-term care. So if you think about that, then just sticking with monetary value of the older age dependency ratio might not be inclusive of the dynamics in a society. In addition, a lot of the value and contributions that older adults can make is conditioned on how healthy they are. It's conditioned on how healthy they are. So healthy aging, investing in young people and middle-aged people and older people in terms of prevention and health preservation matters hugely for their well-being across their whole life course, but also in terms of how engaged and contributing they are as they get older. Additionally, actually, we relate a lot across generations. Turns out that intergenerational transfers are important for young people. Grandparents and grandkids seem to be a good combination. But beyond that, it's very clear financially that there are more financial transfers from right to left over people's lifetimes by a long shot than left to right. When you think about this old age dependency ratio, it depends how you do the level at which you do the math. Also think about this. There's this fabulous study that was done by Esther Duflo in South Africa when South Africa started its pension system, and they started a pension system in black townships and randomly allocated pensions by township and then studied the impact. And what they found was that, first of all, 38% of young children living in these townships were being raised by their grandparents, and 60 to 71% of maternal orphans were living with grandparents or great-grandparents. But in the pension experiment, what they found was that for the grandmothers, the black grandmothers who received pensions, compared to those living in townships where they didn't receive pensions, the granddaughters of the women receiving the pensions were taller, weighed more, were healthier, and stayed at school. Another non-U.S. example of why social protection policies are family policies. And we're all interconnected. So, there are a lot of myths and there are a lot of fears about being an aging society, and most of them actually don't hold water, as it turns out. I don't have time to go through all of them, so I hope I'm giving you some feeling for it. But we are very much held back by those myths and fears in terms of preparing and figuring out how to do something we've never done before in human history, which is have long lives as a society. We have never done this one. And when you've never done it, it actually helps to think about how we want to do it. What society do we want to be in? How should we invest? How should we construct things? Do we need new kinds of social institutions and approaches in a society we've never lived in before? So let's consider what some of the opportunities are. I mentioned that now older adults play lots of roles in society. And in fact, what we have ahead of us is what some social scientists call the beanpole family of many generations in a family, not just 3. But in addition, if you survey this current cohort of older adults, not only do they have aspirations for themselves, but their aspirations could, if we learned how to harness them, confer huge benefit. So older adults bring, as it has been pointed out, the only increasing natural resource in the world, period. A huge amount of untapped social capital, which happens to be healthier and better educated than any cohort of older people in the history of the world. Could that help? If you thought about the fact that there's one adult for every child, one older adult for every child in the world, could that somehow be good for our kids? If we learned how to create roles and matches that could ensure that every child has a caring adult besides their parent who's invested in them. In addition, the attributes of getting older in this, if we believe that there are stages of adult development all the way to the oldest stages, the attributes of getting older include several defining characteristics of wanting to leave the world a better place than you found it, leaving a legacy, and impatience, which is sometimes framed as, if not now, when? What am I waiting for? Let's do it. And there are very interesting creative capabilities of older minds, which include a high degree of ability to recognize really big, important problems, have the patience to figure them out, the skills of a lifetime to peel them apart, and the synthetic ability to draw on a lifetime of objective and subjective knowledge to figure out innovative solutions. We do have a few of those complex problems, and it might be worth trying to put more older brains to leading in their solution. So there are lots of questions, I think, that we need to ask. Are there benefits or just costs of an aging society? Could we, if we understood them, could we create a metric that could actually drive better policy decision making? Could we even make a new kind of benefit cost expression that took into account all the ways older people contribute to society, monetized and non-monetized, and appreciate the real and potential value? And would that drive new kinds of decision making? So for example, can we think about the wealth of an aging population, the intergenerational transfers between family members, the social capital that's being contributed, like that $162 billion in volunteering even at the moment, and the percent of the population that's not disabled instead of just counting heads within an age group? Could we get a little sophisticated? So how do we go forward? Well, first, ultimately, this whole conversation is in part about our social compact as a society. Who do we value? Who do we not value? How do we develop a cohesive society that values all ages and can invest in people to support each other's success and protect the vulnerable of any age. How do we optimize social capital? How do we make sure that our kids are going to grow up healthy and stay healthy through their whole life course? And some particular points, which is how do we educate young people to prepare for longer lives? If you watch the paper, somewhere less than 10% of Americans are prepared for retirement financially. How do we get our young people to get ready for that? How do we invest in them to be healthy? How do we design health systems? And I say that broadly. A health system that creates health includes public and population health as well as medical care. Can we design those systems in a way that actually optimizes health at every age? And it turns out, I think, that how you do that for older people would be better for young people. That's a long conversation than what we currently have. Can we design cities for old and young? And if we did it, I bet that we'd have designs that would be better for everybody. Can we tap the capabilities of older adults, which I've described? And in particular, by doing that, can we figure out how to create roles for the last third of all of our lives? Because we're going to be living a third of our lives after retirement. So I'm going to conclude by talking about one experiment in that regard, which Tom already mentioned, which is the ExperienceCore, which starts from this thinking. First, we don't have roles for people in this country for the last third of their lives. We never did this one before. Secondly, we know that staying active matters into the oldest stages, physically, cognitively, socially. And third, we know that as people get older, can be very traumatic to shift from work roles to whatever retirement means. In the U.S., old age, because we haven't yet designed it, is a role-less role, with loss of social connectedness, decreased structured activities, loss of friends, and how we create a new era for this last third of life that actually optimizes well-being is an unanswered question. So, in fact, in developed countries, living this extra 30 years means that we've added a whole new stage of human life before people get sick and die, which we don't know what to do with. Now, we do have this little problem. We have profound unmet social needs. We have profound unmet social needs, and we have a huge population that could do well if they could make a difference and wants to. Is there some way to put these together? So what if we could create new, meaningful, generative ways for people to stay engaged after retirement, things that matter to them, things that make it worth getting up in the morning? And what if we could hide inside that ways to promote their health, increasing their physical and cognitive social activity? Then we create a win-win that might give us an avenue into untapped opportunities of this immense success of creating longer lives. So one model for that, which Tom mentioned, and I'll conclude with this, is the ExperienceCore, which I designed with a colleague, Mark Friedman, in the late 80s and early 90s. ExperienceCore can look like this. This is a gentleman who I knew very well, who was living in senior housing. Actually, he was an amputee from diabetes, hadn't left senior housing in 10 years, and then he volunteered for a program called ExperienceCore. The ExperienceCore is an evidence-based model designed by public health scientists and early childhood educators together. It recruits volunteers 60 and older who serve in public elementary schools in kindergarten through third grade. And we design meaningful roles that the principals say are their greatest unmet needs for the children's success. And then we train these volunteers in those roles They serve in a high-intensity way, 15 hours per week, both because that makes them fully part of the school community and trusted to do important things, and because if you care about prevention, if you drop in a gym 1 hour a week, you get almost no benefit, but if you do it 15 hours a week, you might get a lot, if it works. And then people volunteer through a full school year. It happens that 80% come back for another year or another year, another year. And we deploy them in a critical mass. The number that the principal says is enough to shift the outcomes for a whole grade, or all 4 grades. And train them in teams to give people both a new social network and a problem-solving locus. Different from other models of 1,000 points of light volunteering, we provide a small stipend for reimbursement for expenses, because most older adults living on fixed incomes don't have the money to volunteer 15 hours a week, buy car fare, buy lunches, maybe get some clothes because they haven't been in a school in 50 years. Or a little extra spending money to buy some pencils for the kids. Over the years, we have designed a whole variety of roles for older adults, tested them, rolled them out. From what the principals always say is their first 3 needs are literacy support, literacy support, literacy support, so we always start with that, but many other roles in terms of math and computer support, teaching children how to resolve conflict without violence, school attendance, parental outreach, and more recently, health promotion contents. ExperienceCore brings value to both generations. And I hope, while it's only one model, that it can serve as its principles are about what we need, which is a win-win for both generations in any one role. Societal benefits from older adults, and health and well-being gains for older adults. Roles that meet generative desires, roles that keep people active and healthy and engaged. ExperienceCore is now actually in 23 U.S. cities, including the first 5 in 1996. We funded in a national demo in New York. It still has one in the Community Service Society of New York. This is an evidence-based model. I figured that older people would show up to make a difference, which they do, if they believe the model will matter. They don't show if they think it's garbage. And they don't stay if they think it won't work. But they come. And we deploy them in the kinds of roles I described, in teams or one-on-one, with the hypothesis that they would both impact directly on the success of children and improve the environment of the whole school and support the efficacy of the teachers, and we have a lot of preliminary data to support those. And with the theory that ultimately what we would see is improved academic performance, improved school climate, and improved teacher retention. The early data is very supportive of this. We see consistently decreased behavioral problems by a large amount in the schools that ExperienceCore volunteers serve in, and significant improvements in academic performance on tests, as well as by a variety of other parameters. And the we did a pilot study with NRTA a few years ago, and they came to the conclusion that from the teacher's perception, having senior volunteers in their classrooms in this model really improved their sense of satisfaction in these public schools in terms of their teaching, and had the great potential to decrease teachers dropping out. So interestingly, putting older adults in schools in models that work and roles that work changes the perceptions of principals and teachers about whether older people have anything to offer. It changes it hugely. I can tell you lots of stories about it, but we don't have time. It also improves the children's assessment of older people in their lives, to have these individuals who really make a profound difference in their success and well-being. On the older adult side, we designed the ExperienceCore to increase physical, cognitive, and social activity, and we have a lot of theories which are being borne out in early data that this should decrease mobility disability and improve both cognitive and, performance and decrease falls and frailty, as well as improve psychosocial well-being and people's being embedded in social networks that are caring for each other. So the preliminary evidence is that the intermediate risk factors that you need to see changed for the older people to suspect there will be long-term outcomes that are beneficial are showing meaningful improvements. But ultimately, people show up because they feel like they're making a difference, and that matters. So programs like ExperienceCore have the potential to help an aging population stay healthy while bringing significant benefit and really tackling the most important issues in our society. We have a formal randomized controlled trial of ExperienceCore going on in Baltimore, but have preliminarily said, well, what's the evidence that there would be a good return on investment? Because no program's free. And the early economic benefit data from ExperienceCore are very heartening, that it would be highly cost-effective or even cost-saving if less than 1% of the students who were reached in this program end up graduating from high school who otherwise would not have. So I think I'll ask all the educators whether you think that's a reasonable thing to bet on. But critical mass matters, and images of older people matter. These are ExperienceCore volunteers in one school in Baltimore. Every one of these people have served 15 hours a week for 2 or more years through full school years. Just looking at pictures changes perceptions. You'd want these people in your school. So can we build social capital? ExperienceCore is actually the first experiment in asking that question. Can you take a stock of human capital and by investing as a civic society in programs to harness that in ways that people believe in or are impactful, can you end up then with effective collective action to secure our kids' future and potentially to tackle other problems? Our experience would say, yes, you can do that, but science matters and theory matters, and how you design it matters. So I'm going to end by just talking about saying that there are lots of models that are springing up of senior volunteering. And one of the key issues for us is how to create these high-impact win-wins for an aging society. That is a huge question ahead of us, and if we can do it, then everybody wins. So we have a number of goals that we have to confront with optimism and with the essential need to find the wins. Because the alternative is not good for our kids or their future lives as older adults, and it's not good for the current older adults who used to be kids. And it's not good for us as a society, as our family. So we need to put the myths aside and figure out how to transform society in a way that matches who we want to be in the face of a period in history we never experienced before. If we do that, I am confident we can construct a right balance for a great long-term future. Thank you.
Great. So, thank you very much, Dean Freed. I'm so grateful that you'd come to Teachers College and bring your life course perspective and your your dream and aspirations for the kind of intergenerational capacity that I think does reside here to Teachers College and to share that with us. So I know you've agreed to spend a few minutes taking questions, so I'm going to just open it up and say that if you've got a question, please do not be bashful.
Yes, hi.
I've been a post-social behavior researcher for many years, and when I first started my work, there was a federal program called RSVP,
Right.
Retired Senior
There
Volunteer.
still is.
Okay, so how would someone access this? I've been trying to access it for people, and I can't seem to find it.
I think I'm not an expert on where to go. I know the Community Service Society of New York has an RSVP program. They're down on 22nd and Park.
They don't seem to be too aware of
Oh, is that right? I'm not sure. So there are a lot. I'd like to be able to help you quickly, but I don't know the quick answer. I assume that Community Service Society had that, and the reason I assume that is that that was one of the criteria for being able to apply for an ExperienceCore grant in 1996. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yeah. Hi.
I'm just wondering, since chronic disease is such an issue with the elderly also, and I saw that you did some of your research about, I think I saw depression up there, frailty and all of it. Have you looked at, are they, in relation to chronic disease, diabetes, and stuff like that? Is there any evidence that people are doing better in health respects, the elderly?
You mean in ExperienceCore?
Yes, I guess.
Well, there is early evidence. Anecdotally, absolutely. So I can tell you, because I used to do a lot of the recruiting for ExperienceCore myself with my own shoe leather. And I got to know all the volunteers pretty well. I know a lot of the anecdotes. And the anecdotes are that people signed up with a fair amount of depressive symptomatology, and that it resolved when they had a reason to get up in the morning, a structure in their life, a place to go that mattered, something they were doing they believed in, and their minds, as one of the volunteers always said to me, I feel like somebody dusted off the cobwebs in my head. And they had a new social networks. For face validity, we require 15 hours a week. In ExperienceCore, the average amount of time older volunteers spend in the school is 25 hours a week. So people come, they stay, and their symptomatology seems to improve markedly. We also see a lot of improvements anecdotally. We haven't had the power to measure this in terms of distal chronic disease outcomes, but for example, a lot of the volunteers will tell me that in the summer when they're not in the schools, their diabetes, they require a lot more medication for their diabetes. Because when they're in the schools, we've measured it, they actually, people who were inactive previously are expending on average 700 kcals a week more than they were before they were in the school. So you could imagine you're walking around the school a lot, you have to get to the school 3 to 5 days a week, you're getting up and down from those ridiculously low chairs, you're climbing stairs, you're doing lots of stuff. And in fact, the amount of exercise they're getting, which we've measured, is what you would want if you were doing an exercise trial in older people. It's the same amount. So they report that they need less medication when they're in ExperienceCore, and more medication during the summer would go along with it. So I think that there are likely meaningful benefits. We haven't had the power to study it so that I can give you the definitive answer. Yeah. Yes, 3 in the back.
You may have already said this before I came in, but I wondered about the training period and what the training you did with those who participated, and did you have any reaction from the parents of the children
Right.
regarding that?
Right, good question. So over the years, we have tackled all of that. Each time we developed a role for older adults, it was based on what the principals said were their greatest unmet needs that we thought matched what older adults could contribute. And then we designed the roles from a gerontologist perspective and an early childhood intervention perspective. and melded them. And then we developed a formal 8-day training program, which over a 2-week period of time, which included role training in several roles, because people get to do multiple roles, but also in overall training about what schools are like these days, how you function in a school as a volunteer, who you report to, what your responsibilities are, what you can do, what you can't do, et cetera. So a lot of re-socialization.
They have to go through fingerprinting.
And then they have to go through behavioral, you know, whatever the school system in that city requires in terms of screening for criminal background check.
Right.
So they go through formal training. We actually have a graduation ceremony, a really fabulous graduation ceremony that we have dignitaries show up at. And for many older people, this is the first time they ever graduated from anything, and they bring their families, their friends. It's really fabulous. Parents, these people are assigned in roles by the principal. They could be in a classroom. They could be in a cafeteria. It depends what the school says they need and how they design it. It is totally the principal's decision where they go and what they do. And it is the principal's responsibility to handle the relationship with parents, as well as the teachers. Masako.
I am Masako Osako, and from International Longevity Center. And I'm so glad to hear many things today. But one of the things is that you mentioned about 1/3 of our life we spend in retirement on one side. On the other side, there is a profound amount of unmet societal needs. And it seems we have to be very creative, as you said, in bridging those two. And I know a 95-year-old woman in Japan. She's somewhat demented, but once a week she goes to an animal shelter and she pets the cats, and the cats love that. And I think that's a very creative way of contributing to unmet societal needs.
Thank you. Good example. Yes, question.
Yeah, I have a question. A lot of the literature on cognitive psychology brings up this notion of digital natives and digital immigrants, where digital natives are people who grew up with things like this their whole lives, and digital immigrants are generally older folks who have less and less experience with these types of technologies. And really, this is a suggestion that younger folks have a different way of thinking and reacting toward the world based on these new devices. And I'm just thinking in terms of human capital, can you describe any issues or challenges in that regard of increasing the amount of technology having an impact on our lives and how the young and the old relate to each other?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, in a microwave, from an ExperienceCore perspective, what we found is that a lot of older adults really want to get trained to be computer literate, computer savvy. And we have ended up doing some of that for the community. But we actually have found that for older adults, the best way for them to be computer literate and computer savvy is for them to work with the kids and teach them. And if people who have to teach have to learn. And it works really well. But I mean, you guys are probably much more knowledgeable than I am about the ways in which being a digital native actually rewires your brain, because there is some suggestion that it does. And it's probably some for the good and some maybe not. But it is an important divide for older adults to cross in this world, because there are many disadvantages if you can't swim in those waters. Thank you. Yes?
I have another issue that you're not addressing. You're addressing an extremely important issue, but there is another group than the one that you described. And that's the group that would be represented, for example, by people here in this room. People who are very And those are people for whom there doesn't seem to be a place. They'll go to Princeton and take courses in art history, perhaps, but they're craving a meaningful involvement with others. And I'm wondering if that's being looked at all.
So certainly ExperienceCore was the first attempt to look at that. We designed ExperienceCore to be something that people of every background and literacy level above 5th grade reading level could participate in. And we've had many principals, teachers, college graduates who have volunteered in ExperienceCore and loved it. So ExperienceCore is only a starter set of what we need to design and do, and I present it to you because I think it has turned out to work well. And even if it didn't, I think the theory is worth developing further, because we need to create a whole variety of ways that people can stay engaged doing meaningful things, many of which will make the world a better place for everybody. But we have created a new stage of human life, the 3rd stage of life, perhaps after retirement in the 60s, 70s, 80s, when you're well, engaged, have tremendous capabilities, but we haven't designed what to do with it. Yeah. So, yes.
Okay, some words from students. This is very great pleasure. We have students from Columbia's University School of Social Work. So currently we are also going through that course like with aging society. So that's why we are very interested in, and we have this great pleasure to be present here and to hear so many kind of experiences with this. Before my kind of 2 very little questions, I would also like to share the kind of the experience of which I witnessed in China. Once I got the opportunity in China in the evening, when we were just walking in the park, I was so much impressed. And guess what? In the park, everywhere is music. People are dancing. One I said, there were my young people. When I came closer, the old people, the grandparents, they're dancing. I was like, oh my God. So yeah, exercise. Morning is exercise, and you mostly be just the old people that exercising instead of young. So it is. I think it is also we can work more on this kind of cultural conception, how they can perceive themselves. Because in some society, people think after retirement is already nearing that they could not do anything. So how in kind of better way to help them to enhance the awareness that they still can enjoy their life in kind of many different ways. And I have my 2 there's still one more in China. There's small city. There's elderly college. Yeah, the only old people they go there together, like all non-graduate students. They go to school and they have their own classes. And also in this school, based on their different hobbies, they're kind of also training a little class. So by this, what we are talking now is more kind of elderly. They are returning back their knowledge and invest to our young people. But here in that elderly college, they keep investing in themselves. This kind of knowledge or training and the hobby, kind of how to increase. So it is really also a very good experience to share with all of you here. Yeah. And my question is like this. Firstly, also he mentioned, I wanted to ask the same question about the generation gap. I mentioned about the technology, but my concern is how the culturally, usually how you can make sure that old generation, young generation, they can communicate. Do they have kind of potential challenges in this kind of experience course, which I would like to interesting to hear. Second question is, I see your photo and I see all this this experience court. They look like more kind of very healthy grandparents, but we know that in aging society, there's still a large amount of people there. They have their physical limitation and they're not simply able to engage there. So do you have any kind of project or thinking about those kind of group of people?
So yes, yeah. I didn't have time to talk about it, but I will say very briefly that if you look at self-assessed health status from excellent to very good to fair to poor, people in every health status except poor volunteer for ExperienceCore and do very well. And in fact, their health improves more if they're at the good or fair self-assessed health, then, as you would expect, then at the very good or excellent. So people who are in poor health don't volunteer, and they're probably they may well be disabled, and those are rate limiting steps. So I see John standing next to me.
We really have run out of time, but Dr. Freed, I think it's evident that you've stimulated a lot of thinking about this, and I very much appreciate your coming to do that today. I want you all to join me in thanking Dean Freed for speaking with us today. But before you leave, I do want to present Dean Freed with a couple of small gifts. They're both books. And it is perhaps fitting because we're in fact launching the 125th anniversary celebration of the founding of Teachers College. With that, it's perhaps fitting that I give Dean Freed two assigned readings. And one of them, of course, is this brilliant Stand Columbia, which was written by Robert McCaughey. I'm hoping you don't already have it. You probably do.
Don't actually, so I'm thrilled.
But Stand Columbia is the definitive life course history, if you will, of Columbia University. And the other book is a briefer sketch of the founding of Teachers College by Grace Hoadley Dodge. She, along with Walter Hervé, who was at the Board of Education in the late 1880s, and Nicholas Murray Butler, who, of course, at that time was a junior professor, whose dissertation we've never found, actually, here at Columbia. The three of them worked to found an institution that is inextricably linked to Columbia University over these last couple of hundred years or so. And I want you to have these because I think you follow in those footsteps very much as someone who I trust will leave a legacy both in the School of Public Health but at the university with your role here at Columbia. And most importantly, I have removed very carefully the library property certificates so that you can get out. Congratulations to you. Thank you.